Welcome. I'm Neil Chase, the CEO at CalMatters. If you're new to CalMatters, we're a nonprofit newsroom with 35 journalists covering California issues that are most important to the people who live here. And there's nothing more important right now for millions of parents and students than understanding how school's going to work this fall and what we can do to get ready. So thanks for joining us today. If you find this session useful, I hope you're going to sign up with us. Visit calmatters.org, sign up to get our free daily newsletter. And if you're in a position to help us, make a donation. We're a nonprofit newsroom. We'd certainly appreciate it. The host today is Ricardo Cano. He's a reporter on our team who grew up in California's public schools, went to Fresno State, where he was the editor of the campus newspaper, and now covers education for CalMatters. He's been working hard over the past 6 months to track what happened to classroom education when schools had to close in March and what to expect this fall. Ricardo has 4 people here today who are deeply involved in that challenge, and they're going to speak with us and answer your questions. Some of you already submitted questions in advance. Thank you for that. We'll get to as many of those as we can, and it's not too late to ask yours. You can put it in the chat during the session. You can ask on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube with the hashtag for the event, BackToSchoolCA, and Ricardo will ask as many of those as time permits. So with that, Ricardo, it's all yours.
I'm very sorry. I was muted. So thank you, Neil, and thank you to everyone joining us virtually this morning. The 2020-21 school year will be unlike any other that we'll have experienced in our lifetimes. As our state's K-12 schools begin the new year, more than 97% of California's 6.1 million students will be starting their first day of school remotely from their homes. The state has put out new standards and requirements governing how schools will operate this year. The state budget included new standards for distance learning. There are new benchmarks for when schools across the state can begin offering in-person instruction. But there's no other way to put it. As we kick off this year, there will be many uncertainties ahead for the state schools, students, teachers, and parents. As Neil mentioned, we're going to do our best to get as many questions from the audience as we can, and please submit them on the platform you're watching this on with the hashtag BackToSchoolCA. With that, I'm excited to have these 4 speakers here to help us make some sense of this moment, share their valuable perspectives. Joining us is Don Austin, the superintendent of the Palo Alto Unified School District and a former principal, teacher, and football coach. Lakeisha Young, the founder and director of the Oakland Reach, a nonprofit focused on engaging parents and improving education for underserved communities in Oakland. Heather Huff, the executive director of Policy Analysis for California Education, an independent, nonpartisan research center based at Stanford University, and a Davis parent. And last but not least, Elijah Tsai, a senior at Lincoln High School in Stockton, and state president of the California Association of Student Councils. Elijah started the new school year this week. So to kick us off, we're right in the thick of the back to school season, and obviously that is looking different than previous years. And I just wanted to pose this broad question here. How are each of you feeling about this upcoming school year? And for the folks who started the new year, this week, what has that experience been like so far? And Elijah, I'd like for you to kick us off.
Sure. Well, I, like many other students, came into the school year with a lot of doubt. I was scared. It's my senior year, and so it's my, there are a lot of events and a lot of both like social kind of things that happen during the year, as well as it's the last year that I'll be in high school. Those 2 are combined. And so knowing that those things wouldn't be there, and just the uncertainty that came with kind of how school would be, especially we went through distance learning in the spring, and so I had some doubts. However, I think what having been in school for I think today's day 4. It is pretty robust. I do have deltas and things that I would like to see improve, but as for am I learning? And the answer to that question is yes. I mean, to the point where, I was talking to the panel before we went in. I just took a test this morning about like 30 minutes ago. So I mean, distance learning is happening. I'm feeling kind of in between about it, especially with like my senior year. But I'm excited to learn. Now, am I and I'll touch on this later. I do not. I know there are many other students that do not that are not able to access the education I'm accessing right now in the same way. For instance, I have a computer, I have internet access with a hard line that I'm running through my house. Other students don't have that. They don't have a dedicated computer, and it's struggling. I've heard and seen both in class and like around my peers falling out, and there's major inequity in that. I'll touch on that later. As for me right now, I'm doing okay.
Thank you. And Lakeisha, your kiddos began the new year in Oakland Unified. How have you been feeling this week?
Not happy is what we've been feeling this week. And I think I speak for myself personally as a mother of 3, as well as a, co-founder and advocate of an organization that supports parents. Similar to Elijah, I have a daughter who's a senior, and I'm not sure what Elijah's experience is, but, we're starting a school year off where my daughter has worked very hard during her academic career to get to this place. And obviously, the pandemic itself is causing a lot of emotional stress and social stress on students who are having much different plans about the way that they were going to spend. But our kids are also starting off this week with 50 minutes of instruction a day. And so for a child that is looking to apply to college and be competitive, that is not a strong start. And I think I also speak for a lot of families. A lot of families we've supported, through our hub this summer, to share that, a major concern of our families is learning loss. A lot of our families experienced immediate and longer term learning loss in the spring. And here we are 5 or 6 months later, and it is feeling like that it continues to be perpetuated. So that is how I'm feeling personally as a parent, and how many parents in Oakland are feeling about the start of the school year.
Right. And Don, your schools are going to start next week, the new year. Give us a picture of how you're feeling heading up to that.
Well, I think a combination of the first 2 speakers. I think a lot of us are in the same boat in that we're trying to balance this acknowledgement of loss. Right, there's a loss of experiences for our students that just simply will not be replicated in distance learning environments. We, like everyone else, really, we can guess, but we have no idea of how much learning loss has occurred due to the closures, and it will disproportionately impact the families that needed us the most to be with their kids every day. We're balancing that, though. We had our kickoff yesterday for the entire district. Our theme for the year is Ambassadors of Hope, because regardless of the realities of the closure and the virus and how it's impacting families, both through their health, but also through all of these other pieces of their life, their income, their livelihood, and experiences. We know as schools, we're counted on to keep our heads up and to point to hope and gather optimism, find wins in each day, because they're there. They're just harder to find right now because there's so much uncertainty in the world. So, for my job, right now, some of the biggest challenges are trying to manage the practical aspect of coming back to school while acknowledging the real fear that's out there all the way around it also. So challenging times for everybody involved.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing your perspective. Heather, you're a parent, but part of your, role is having that 100-foot ledge view of what's happening across the state. How are you feeling?
Much like the other panelists, I'm worried as a parent and as somebody that really tends to and cares for all of the state students. We know that families are hurting right now, and we also know that children have experienced learning loss, are continuing to experience trauma, loneliness, all of the things that go along with that school closure. But I also feel optimistic because I think we're in a much better place now than we were in the spring. What happened in the spring was, for all intents and purposes, emergency education. Every educator that I know was scrambling to provide a basic level of service for children and families. And what we see across the state now is a real concentrated attempt to try to focus on learning. And is it enough? I think, that there's variation, huge variation across the state. We also know that we need to see a much stronger investment in our public schools from the state and federal level. So there's lots of areas where we need to continue to stay tightly focused. But one of the things that we'll also need to do is continue to bring evidence into the conversation. We're in unprecedented times. Nobody's ever lived through this before. And we don't have a roadmap for how to proceed. And as everybody's mentioned, the conversation, the context is constantly changing. So as I'm optimistic, as both a parent and a researcher, I am also very alert and ready to continue pushing in with that evidence, with that support, to make sure that every school in every district across the country is helping all kids, but particularly the most vulnerable.
Absolutely. And so, Elijah, real quickly, I'm hoping you touched on this, but I'm hoping you can take us through what a normal day has looked like you for so far. How much time are you on the computer? What has your class schedule looked like? What are some of the differences that you've seen so far compared with what your experience was with distance learning in the spring?
Now, as for learning loss, we are Lincoln High School in the Lincoln Unified School District. We have it's just basically a normal school day online, and that brings up its own separate issues. So I am receiving it's still interesting. There's different things. The interactiveness, as some of the other panelists are talking about, is it's very, very minimal for students, unless the teacher makes a huge effort to get students talking, or sets up an activity in such a way that has students interactive. Students are just sitting there. It's one big great call, and you don't have any of that one side chatter, but two discussion inside of a class, and it's difficult being on for this amount of time. And I mean, you have me staring at the screen for 7 hours, and then afterwards I get off and maybe take a break and then come back and have 4 to 5 hours of homework, depending on the class load. But that's for me as an as an AP student. I know it's different for other students. Right.
And we do have audience questions coming in, and I just want to jump right to them. We have a question from Ursula Schoenig. I apologize, Ursula, if I mispronounced your last name, but Ursula wants to know, it's her understanding that middle and high school students are, perhaps more nimble when it comes to, navigating distance learning. But what about students in grades K through 5th grade, elementary students? What are some factors to consider when it comes to their distance learning experience? And Heather, I think it'd be great if you kick this off.
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's critically important. We have done at PACE, my team has done a lot of research trying to consolidate what we know from the literature, from prior practice about distance learning for different levels of students and how we can bring those practices in. The most important thing to know from prior implementation is that interaction, where students are interacting with teachers about their learning, they're getting feedback on their learning, they're communicating and collaborating together. That is the most essential piece of instruction, whether it's in person or from a distance. So that needs to be implemented at every grade level. And that synchronous time where students are on a screen communicating with each other, it really only counts if they're communicating with each other, not necessarily if they're kind of sitting and receiving information. That's even more true at the younger grades, where we know that kindergartners, for example, have very small attention spans. It's hard for them to sit and watch something and engage online. And I know I have an incoming first grader, so this is something that I'm very experienced with. So as you go lower into the grades, you have to really try to bring into the virtual setting the things that students are getting in real life. They thrive on play, they thrive on interaction. And there's no doubt that it's harder to do that in a virtual setting, but it's not impossible. And so the challenge will be taking what we know from the learning sciences, but also practice as educators, and trying to translate that into distance rather than abandoning that in a distance context.
And when we're talking about how schools can really help elementary students have a meaningful experience through distance learning. Don?
Well, my mind goes to a few different places. One is, how are we doing it here in Palo Alto? And number two is, it's another great example of the disparities across the state right now. I was able to visit our school sites yesterday, and they're preparing for the materials distribution. And then if you're a student here, you're picking up especially if you're a primary age kid. So if you're K through 3, you're picking up a brand new Chromebook that has cameras on both sides of it to interact better with our platform of Seesaw for the little kids. And you're also picking up a bunch of materials that we're passing out and sitting home with families. We have book rotations. We have lots of things. And then maybe a topic that we'll touch on or maybe not. Our community is setting up, for better or worse, learning pods, which are community started learning centers for students that are common in communities like this. So the kids, again, you're not going to replicate the school experience, but that experience for the youngest learners is probably going to have the most variation out of everything we look at between the different school districts. And that's scary because this is the most important time. If you get a student to about 3rd or 4th grade reading at level, they almost always remain at level. And if you don't, it becomes increasingly hard to catch up in time. So again, the most critical part of a kid's education is also the hardest to replicate right now.
And, we're getting a lot of questions about how schools are serving, students who have parents who might be, having to be away from home because they work essential jobs, how we're serving students who might need technology to connect with distance learning. And, right off the top of my head, I'm thinking about the efforts, Lakeisha, that you've spearheaded locally through your nonprofit, raising money for a virtual summer school program and a virtual learning hub. And can you just share us some of your perspective in terms of how families at the ground level are navigating through this experience right now, and what are some of the needs that your nonprofit and your effort for the virtual learning hubs is trying to fill?
Sorry, I was on mute the whole time. So what we're hearing in our community, you put yourself on mute so you don't disrupt, and then when it's your time to talk, you don't have it off mute, but just trying to add some humor. So what we're hearing on the ground in Oakland is that families are really concerned about the health risk related to COVID. We have families, sometimes we have multiple families living together. We may have, and multi-generational, folks with pre-existing conditions. And so I would say that the way we designed the hub was so that someone in the family, whether it was a guardian or a relative, could really support homeschooling with live synchronous learning with teachers. And then we made sure that each kid had a laptop, and we made sure that any family that did not have reliable internet access was able to, they received a hotspot, and we'll be sort of covering those hotspots for a year. So I first want to say that what we've seen in Oakland is that, yes, there's a lot of families that have to work, and there's also a lot of families that have extended family and are living with extended family. And so in terms of thinking about the real safety concerns that families have around kids, contracting COVID or it coming home to other family members, we really designed that virtual hub to provide like engaging live instruction for families, at home. And I think in terms of just the district, we are in our first, 4 days of school. So in Oakland, we are still waiting on a large shipment of laptops and Chromebooks that are supposed to be distributed to families. So you can imagine we started school August the 10th, and we won't receive those until the end of August. So when we launched the hub, we did have to fundraise to purchase computers and hotspots for families, and those families got to keep those, so they now have them at the start of the school year. And in terms of what schools can do, again, I'm listening to Elijah's story, and I'm looking at him, I'm thinking about, I have a 17-year-old, and, it's challenging. And I still, his statement around how his school day looks still really, really highlights the concerns that we have in Oakland around how much instruction and learning time and how equitable is that looking across the state. And when I hear him speak about being on class all day, it really, really concerns myself. It's concerning parents who are probably listening from Oakland to this, of just around the equity in instruction that our families are receiving during this tough time. And so in the last part I'll add is, as we are moving into the fall, we are planning to launch a phase 2 of the hub that will launch in September. And that will be providing a lot of sort of mitigating as well as accelerating learning loss supports and programs for families, because we want to really use this as a time to innovate and expand for our communities that have been left behind. We see this as an opportunity. Our parents have a lot of hope and a lot of desires, and they plan to have these be the babies that go to college. So we need to deliver on that for them.
Right. Thank you for sharing that, Lakeisha. And I know that again, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty, and vast majority of schools are not at this point. But I want to touch on this, and starting with Dawn. It's hard to predict how public health conditions are going to change in throughout the year, but presumably at some point, you and your local school board will have the autonomy to decide if and how you're going to offer some form of in-person instruction once Santa Clara County is off the state's COVID-19 monitoring list for 2 weeks. when that moment happens, how fast would your schools transition to the hybrid model that you were planning for? What steps need to take place before that? And I'm also curious to hear from folks from the rest of the panel, what information do you feel schools need to be communicating to parents and students so that you feel empowered to make an informed decision about whether to send your child or participate in in-person instruction?
Sure. First of all, I'd say we have, declining confidence in the watch list. I mean, it only took about a week or so to see that the watch list had serious holes in it, and that the data is already backlogged, and that was not shared immediately. We've been on and off the watch list at least 3 times in the last 3 weeks. So if the reality is that the numbers are going to tip to the worst side, we don't anticipate coming off of that watch list anytime in the near future. Our school district did do something a little different. We thought having some certainty in a time when there's very little was important. So we have told our families we will have no whole-scale return to hybrid or any other model face-to-face until at least October 12th. So even if we're off the list for 2 weeks before that, we're not coming back. We think it's really important that everything is lined up. Even today, we're still out marking campuses, putting up sneeze guards, doing everything like we're returning. But the reality is it's going to be a little while. Our secondary schools, we have a very narrow window. If we're not back in by November, then we will announce that we're out for the entire semester. A return midstream at secondary level is more challenging for a lot of reasons. Elementary, we want to get them back as soon as we can. And special populations, including our moderate, severe special education, we'd have them back tomorrow if we could. So there are some different phases in there. Once we're off for 14 days, that'll start our 10-day notification process to bring back small groups and potentially elementary. Secondary, it's looking increasingly like it could be the entire semester.
Perspective, Don, and giving folks an example of at least how one school district in the state is navigating this. Heather, I know that you wanted to weigh in on this as well.
Yeah, I think that there is really strong reason to believe that distance learning in some capacity will be here for a very long time, perhaps the entire school year. We know that tech companies, for example, have allowed employees to relocate. They're not coming back to work until the summer of 2021. They've canceled all events that long. Looking at where the virus is continuing to spread with continuing high rates, we know that it will be present and until perhaps we have the vaccine. Having said all of that, we've seen polls and surveys that say that around a quarter of teachers don't feel comfortable being in school because they are older, because they are immunocompromised, because they live with someone who is immunocompromised. We also know that about a quarter of parents report the same thing. And this, of course, varies widely by locale. But that all indicates that at least some people will demand distance education while the virus is still out in our communities. So I think the right way to approach this is for distance learning to be thought of as the primary mode of education, with in-person being layered on as it's safe for the students who need it most. So the example of what's happening in Palo Alto is exactly what research supports. Bringing every student in and kind of spreading that in-person time across the entire student population won't have the best outcomes for kids. We know that some kids need to be in person either because they don't have reliable internet at home, they might not have reliable housing, they might not have reliable food. we also know that some students need more one-on-one instructional support because of heightened learning needs. So being really thoughtful about who gets to come back, but having those students come back to an in-person model that still is fundamentally offered through distance learning. And there's a lot of benefits to making that decision now. You can communicate that with families. You can ensure that you have that reliability, that your teachers can start to train around the delivery of that mode. But you can also ensure that the things that you're building take advantage of the benefits of distance learning. There's a lot that's not better about distance learning, but there are some benefits, including economies of scale. If you combine classrooms, for example, you can do fewer lesson plans. You can consolidate lectures, share materials. So if we make the decision now as a system that that is the primary mode, then we can really start to build all of our support systems around making that good for students.
And so we have a reader question, audience question from Sandra Shove, and other folks have asked this as well. How are districts addressing the needs of students with disabilities, both the specialized services that they're entitled to receive under their IEPs, and inclusion with their non-disabled peers during this time. I'm thinking, Dawn, this is this is your reality right now, and I'm hoping you can kind of help give us some guidance.
Yeah, we just had our board meeting Tuesday, and the bulk of it was dedicated to special education services because it's time, right? So I think our special education families have been the most patient, and we appreciate that, but the patience is over, and now it's turning to some frustration. The bulk of students with IEPs are going to be handled pretty nicely this year. We can get services to most of our roughly 1,200 special education students. The problem is on the outliers. So if you are severely impacted, if you in our case, families that have students who are really impacted with autism, they're struggling because they're used to having somebody sit with their child in a school day, a one-to-one aid, and now they don't have that support at home, and their kids are struggling, and the parents are watching their kids struggle. It's impacting their homes. Medically fragile students, online environment is not going to serve their needs. So we're just like everyone else. We're looking for ways to get people with them that are safe and allowable under current circumstances. Because as much as I'd like to say we can serve the needs of all students through distance learning, that's just not true. And coming to grips with that is hard. But I think the people that are clinging to this notion of, oh yeah, we figured it out from the spring, and we can serve your child's needs in all cases. It's not practical. So acknowledging that, first of all, I think was important. But next, we're going to exhaust every possible avenue to see how we can get people physically with some of our most challenged students as early as possible.
And Elijah, I want to pivot to you. You and millions of other students across the state have been learning from home for the last 5 months. And I'm just wondering, as much as you're comfortable sharing with us, how has being away from your classmates, your teachers, how has that affected, your social, emotional well-being mental health? And for the other folks on the panel, what are some things that schools can do in this space to address, the social emotional needs of kids right now?
It's difficult. It's really, really difficult for students. There is hardly any time to connect with other students, and during the school day, when you have a 7-hour school day where you're expected to sit down in class and to listen and pay attention and participate, there is no time to interact with other students. No time I have not made a single new friend during the school year, and that does not come from an antisocial place. That comes from I'm unable to interact with my peers around me. And I mean, personally, I know it's been difficult, and just to there's this weird, our generation, our relationships are over text. Our relationships are over the phone, or the students, the responsible students, the ones staying in. It's hard. It's you're isolated. You're with family members, and depending on what your home situation is, that's difficult. And so students need support. Students need that interaction time. And so I remember, or I think it was Hugh was talking about kind of economies of scale, and having having classes. And I really think that is a direction that schools should not go. And I know I think that this distance learning exacerbates larger classes, especially in larger public schools who don't get a lot of funding to have more teachers or something like that. Because students being in a class, I have, as an example, I'm in a class of 32, and then I'm also in a peer mediation class of 13. And the time I get to spend with the teacher, the time I get to spend interacting, is so much more impactful. And so peer mediation is one of the best parts of my day right now, because I get to talk to other people. In the other classes, I do not, and it's difficult to sit there for 6 hours, to sit there and not be able to do anything. So I think, and that's just this is the bare minimum. So students, you can imagine what it is for students who are struggling before this happened, students who have things in their lives that are difficult to deal with. And so what needs to happen are access to resources, counseling, and any other if there's any other panelists that want to weigh in on this, on what schools are doing to kind of address this, I'd really appreciate that. But that is from my perspective as a student, and I know that there's, that is this is just one image, and there's so many other stories from all across California of students struggling.
Heather, I know that you wanted to chime in, so please do.
Yeah, and I do want to clarify what the research suggests are the economies of scale that we could find in distance learning. It's not to make classes bigger, but rather to take the things that can be done centrally and do them centrally to free up teacher time to engage with students. Because part of what we see happening right now is that it is simultaneously true that families and students feel like they are not getting enough interaction with educators, and that educators are working harder than they ever have in their lives. And so the solution has to be found elsewhere, right? Teachers are taking the years that they've invested in their curriculum and trying to move all of that online, curating videos, developing new instructional content, worksheets, assignments, new grading procedures, new attendance procedures. They're reinventing their classroom in every classroom across California. And so where we could find those economies of scale is by saying, we're going to centrally curate those videos. We're going to facilitate shared lesson planning so that teachers can do what is really their value add, which is communicating one-on-one or in small groups with students to really facilitate and enhance their learning. And I think that one of the problems that we're seeing right now, though, is that over many years in this state, we have dramatically underfunded our schools. So we don't have a lot of extra people in schools to do things like what I'm describing or to attend to mental health. So, for example, California has very consistently ranked in the bottom nationally in terms of student access to mental and physical health supports. We also have fewer teachers and general educators in our schools than in any other state. And so now this crisis has kind of laid that bare. We're in a place where we need more people to support students, and we really just don't have them. And so I do think that, you know, on top of trying to train teachers to help them to respond to this, providing some of those economies of scale centrally, we also have to have a broader discussion about how we invest in public schools here in California.
And anybody else wanna add to this?
I just think another thing that also needs to happen is I was talking when I first introduced myself, I was talking about like the senior year experience and like what like kind of like the activities that we're missing out on. And I know that the ASBs will at my school will do something. But I think that there needs to be an emphasis starting off to connect students. If we're talking about inequity or like just even not even just inequity, like students' hobbies. Like I am big into video games. If you see this headset, it's gamer. But there are other students that are not. There are other students whose hobbies include like just hanging out with friends in person, and that can't happen right now. So providing opportunities for students to connect. It's difficult to maintain friendships that maybe students have had for years. Like childhood friends with since middle school, they see them every day in their classes. And I've heard stories about students being separated from like by block schedules and not being able to see anybody. And then just for like the way that I'm learning right now, like is if I didn't have the avenues that I learned from playing video games, or like I would not be able to socially interact with my peers, because there's no place to provide that, or not place to provide. It's not provided.
Okay. We have a question from Kat Gallus. Kat wants to know, what are ideas for how teachers can implement interactions, feedback, communications, and collaborating online together in this environment, really emphasizing the how. And, I'm sure that a lot of folks can weigh in on this, but Lakeisha, I'm hoping that you can kick us off here, and we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think I can answer that. And primarily from the direct experience of, designing and launching a hub with 15 teachers virtually this summer. And I think we had about 90+% satisfaction rate from our parents. I think similarly to what we see in person, when we launched the hub, we had professional development weeks for our teachers to come together. And I think the way you think about, I think similarly to what Elijah was saying about the thoughtfulness that's really required when we think about meeting the students' whole needs, I think the same applies for teachers, right? And I think something really awesome that we did in our professional development with our K-8 hub, and specifically with our K-2, the larger group is just like the ability to build relationships and share personal stories and be vulnerable with one another, and just spending that time together as a community of teachers prior to launching with the kids. And part of it is like, again, connecting as much as possible, knowing you're doing it virtually, but we're still, human beings, and we're still connected in so many ways. And then I think the systems that we set up to work together, and the systems those teachers set up to work together. And I think it just created, for the summer school hub, awesome teachers who knew how to engage and connect with families, as well as teachers who knew how to connect with each other. So I do think like continuing to implement those practices that have been in place in person are still key, which is professional development, time for teachers to get together, but just being really thoughtful about being thoughtful about how we're doing this in this new normal, and how we're giving teachers space to build relationships, that are virtual with each other.
how actively are schools looking into outdoor instruction as a viable option, even if just to have, live interactions with their teachers? Dawn, I know that you spoke to this and you gave us, some hard truths about the realities of what could happen when it comes to in-person instruction. But is outdoor, classes or spaces, is that something that's feasible?
You cut off at the very end, but I think I got enough of it. This is one of those perfect examples, right? So people at home read about outdoor being healthier and transmission is less, and in their mind, it's easy. Let's just move outside. But the practical aspect of that is that California is a collective bargaining state. It would need to be negotiated with associations who would raise immediate concerns about whole-scale moves to outside. The variables increase the second you move outside. You now have to deal with weather conditions, circulation, technology, furniture, things like sensitivities for allergies. There's so many things that come into play as soon as you move out of the predictable environment of an indoor classroom that, in my opinion, moving any decent sized district to outdoor is just not, it's not possible. Now, that being said, I think there's lots of opportunity to create spaces for teachers to take breaks, to move their classes outside, and to take advantage of what is largely good weather in California for many months of the year. So, two things. Is outdoor healthy and something we should, embrace in California? Absolutely. Does it make sense to set up tents and move everything outside? No, I wouldn't explore that at all, whole scale.
Local control state, and a lot of the decision making, that happens, is on the plate of school boards and school superintendents. But I'm wondering, when it comes to these distance learning standards, guidance on how to reopen schools and navigating, what essentially are public health decisions. Dawn, Heather, Lakeisha, from your perspectives, is the state doing enough to put schools in a position where they can make, reasonable, informed decisions when it comes to not only reopening schools, but, how they're structuring their distance learning programs? And I wanted to kick us off with Heather.
We have been doing a lot of research and just recently wrote a piece really laying out the case for why a stronger state role is needed in exactly this context. We are in a crisis. We're in a public health crisis. We're in an economic crisis. We are in a learning crisis. And in a time of crisis, that is not the time for local control. That is the time for state leadership, for clear state leadership that provides resources for folks to do the work that they need to do, and to put really clear guidelines for local districts around what will keep kids healthy and safe and what will keep them learning. And so I think that we have seen some of this. Senate Bill 98, which was part of the budget bill that was passed, was a clear attempt to try to put some guardrails around what instruction should look like during this time. And then after that, the governor put out his message about how it would be determined whether schools should reopen. Those two things together at least put the parameters around how local folks should be making this decision. And I think that that's really important. What I think that it doesn't do and it can't do is to say exactly how you're going to do those things locally. So superintendent in Palo Alto just laid out some of the logistical considerations. If you take every district in California, and we have 1,000, they have a different number of school buses, they have different number of staff, they have a different number of buildings. In some places, the buildings are very small, in some places they're very large, right? So getting really down into the weeds about how you would implement health and safety and learning protocols is not something that the state can or should ever do. But the state has a responsibility to make sure that all students in California are learning. The state has to play a role in ensuring that equity across all of those 1,000 school districts in California. And if what happens in the fall is any indication, is based on what happened in the spring, what we will see without that monitoring and that strong state role is incredibly wide variation. Some places that jumped right into distance learning and provided a relatively high quality of instruction. Some places that paused learning and didn't offer any new content, and in fact, didn't require any local engagement from a classroom teacher to a student. So the state really does have a responsibility to make sure that students are being educated during this time in both requirement and in monitoring.
And Lakeisha, I'm curious to hear your perspective here as somebody who works at a very grassroots level with parents.
I'm listening to Heather, and I would have to agree in a lot of ways. I think we've been thinking a lot about how the state should be supporting, again, the innovation and the work happening on the ground. But this conversation really pushes us to talk about the guidance that's needed at that level. Our school district and our teachers union just reached a tentative agreement yesterday that we don't yet have the details of. Right. And we have other districts in the Bay Area that are still in negotiations. We need our teachers, and our teachers need to be supported. Our teachers need to be set up. I mean, we definitely experienced through the hub just the challenges that our teachers had, whether they didn't have adequate infrastructure in their homes, they weren't used to doing online teaching. So meeting the needs of teachers and supporting teachers are key. And we all have to work together really urgently and expeditiously to make sure that kids are learning and getting instruction. So in listening to Heather, and as we've been thinking about how the state needs to get more involved and support, California, it really does. That is an area where having the state be more involved in providing guidance to negotiations around and maybe more guardrails and guidelines around that would have been very helpful, because I think it has put a lot of families in a lot of distress and had us start off our school year in not a way that feels good to us at all.
Hear your take on this.
Well, not everyone is going to like what I'm going to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think the leadership at the state level has been weak throughout. And instead of just ending there, I want to be real specific for just a minute. Authority of when schools are open, closed, and the guidelines haven't come from the California Department of Education. They've come from local county public health department officials. And let's remember, 6, 7, 8 months ago, nobody knew the names of any of these people. And now they've become the most important people in education. They're scientists. They weren't brought up with leadership lenses. And now they're moving into topics like learning loss. I want to hear from my public health department about the science behind disease transmission. I don't want to hear from them about learning loss. And then when we look back just a little bit of time here, it even became blurry who had the authority to open and close schools. The governor stood up in March and talked about how a path to remaining open didn't seem possible, but he never used his authority to close schools. It was implied, but that wasn't how it really worked. So we have 1,000 school districts trying to be creative that are all on their own. That means 1,000 superintendents. That means over 5,000 board members, over 50 counties, each going in their own direction. And in our case, our county's 1,300 square miles, 2 million people in over 30 school districts. Our district alone has 20,000 parents, 2,000 employees, 11,000 students. That's 33,000 people wanting to know what we're doing. And we're one of 1,000 who are, for the large part, on an island doing the best we can and trying to calibrate with those around us. Then the last piece of confusion, we do things that are just absolutely contradictions. Schools are announced closed until you're off a watch list for 14 days and some other conditions. And yet in the same document, they allow for waivers to ask to have your elementary schools back open. And they allow childcare to be on the same campuses that were just closed in the same cohorts that were just prohibited. It makes no sense. So yeah, I've been largely disappointed with state missed opportunities. To as what was stated earlier, in times of crisis, it's not a time for everyone to go out on your own. It is time for some top-down uniformity, and I think it was an absolute missed opportunity, and that opportunity is gone.
We're approaching the end of the hour here, but I wanted to end with this last question. It's hard to think about it right now, but eventually this moment will pass. We will get through this pandemic. And I'm wondering, when that's said and done, what lessons or potential solutions do you hope that we take away from this moment that can help improve public education for California students, particularly for the students most in need? And Lakeisha, I wanted to give you the first take here.
Can you just repeat that question one more time?
Yeah, I mean, it's a broad one, certainly, but I'm just wondering, what you're hoping that we learn from this moment, that we take away from, to help improve public education for California students.
Yeah, I think what I would love to share is that, we were in a crisis prior. We were in an education crisis, definitely in Oakland, and I would say in many other cities in California, prior to a health crisis. And so I think in Oakland, and when we think about the work of the virtual hub that we created, we see this as an opportunity of innovation, an opportunity to provide and give more to families and communities that for decades, and I'm talking about mamas and grandmamas who have been failed by a system. And so I think we can lament about the conditions of what we're in right now. And I think Heather may have said this earlier, or we can really, really come together and create and build, because we are in this for the long haul. And it's going to really require that kind of innovation, that kind of student-centered focus and family-centered focus. We say a lot about it, but oftentimes, I'll let you know, families don't feel it. They don't feel that the focus is on their needs. But this is the time for us to think about how can, for maybe the first time in a really, really long time, we do better by a lot of students and specifically students in underserved communities. You didn't want me to keep going. I know that, right? Oh, technology.
Well, I see I'm live, but I could not hear a word that was said a moment ago. You're still muted. Well, I cannot hear our moderator, so I'm going to jump in and just pretend like I heard a question. In fact, I'm going to answer the question I wish you would have asked. So how's that? I get my own free run at this one. Yeah.
Don, you're okay. Well, technical mishaps notwithstanding, Heather, let's go to you on this one, and hopefully we can get Don back.
What Lakeisha was saying about the need to not look at this as a blip, but rather as laying bare a huge problem that we've already had in this state. We know that we were already 39th in educational spending when you adjust for cost of living. We also know that we have some of the biggest differences in student groups, in test scores and other outcomes compared to other states. And so now is really an opportunity to take stock of where our systems have been failing California's students and to improve them. And the saying, never let a crisis go to waste, I think really comes in play here. Families are hurting, teachers are hurting. It's not an easy time for anybody, but we can take advantage of this to improve things in our state.
And Elijah, you're going to graduate from the system at the end of this year, but what are some lessons you hope we all take away from this moment to help improve education for students in the future?
So Mr. Austin talked earlier about kind of how it's hard for administrators to gauge the learning loss, how it's hard for administrators, and I think it's also hard for administrators to gauge kind of like how their students feel, and that comes and a remedy for that, and something CASC, my organization, has been working for years, or since its inception, is getting students civically engaged. And what do I don't mean like going out to the polls and doing stuff. I mean speaking up about what is happening in their schools. I am one student, and this state is huge. There's 6 million students, and they're all experiencing different things because of local control. So it's really important that those students speak up to their administrators, but also that those administrators provide avenues for students to, to talk to them, to express how they're feeling, to express like we know what is going, like we feel everything that's going on. Students are the largest stakeholder in California, and so that is why our voice is essential to this discussion. In being able to give teachers feedback, both positive and what can be improved on like what will happen. Just to quick off on some of the things that I want to see, and I kind of have a brainstorm session with some other students. Quantifiable homework loads, students are able to gauge and predict like what they're seeing. To continue kind of Miss Young's work, and get those like fix up those inequities with students not having access to technology, meaningful classroom class time, and like decreasing the amount of like screen time we have. I'm not a professional. You guys know what to do. But it's a lot right now. There's like I have a 7-hour day, and then like 5 hours of homework, and that makes 11 hours, and that is not nice. And then teacher communication outside class. Teachers are doing like the most right now, and it's not fair. I got an email from a teacher at like 9:30, and we were expected to like respond back and do stuff for it. That is not right on the students, but that is also not right on the teachers to have them like be active for like 12 hours a day. Anyways, those are my closing thoughts. I spoke fast. Thank you for having me.
Elijah, it was a pleasure having you. Trust me. Don, your final thoughts here on lessons that can be learned from this moment to help improve education.
Sure. Let's start with Elijah, if you guys ever want to move, we have some really nice schools here in Palo Alto. We'd love to have you, or I'll hire you, or whatever. You did such a great job today. Couple things, don't miss the opportunities. I think is important. We use this time to change our bell schedules for two things. We put all of our schools on the same schedule, which will help with some sharing of resources and that economy of scale topic. But also, our secondary schools now will not begin before 9 o'clock in the morning. So we're recognizing that we've got an opportunity to address some sleep pattern things here. But I also think, more globally, I've done more calibrating with my colleagues in other districts up and down the state than I would have ever done without this. And I think looking back, that's probably been a huge missed space for all of time, right? So I think there's an opportunity to really learn from each other and create networks where they didn't exist before. I think if each district, 1,000, wants to try to solve every problem on their own, that's a mistake. And one thing I've shared with our board, there's a reason why all those parody videos that are out there right now are funny. It's because everyone is dealing with exactly the same problems. It might look a little different in your community, but the topics are the same. That means what a great time for us to try to solve problems together instead of 1,000 different approaches to it. So hopefully there's something there that we can tap into and that will stick for the future.
Well, I would just want to say thank you to Don, Lakeisha, Heather, and Elijah for joining us today. Thank you to all the folks who tuned in for your questions and for taking the time out of your morning to have this discussion with us. I'm going to kick it off to Neil to send us home.
And thanks to all of our guests. I can't agree more. It was a fascinating conversation. And Don, you might get to hire Elijah, but we might try to hire him first. So we'll see what happens. If you missed any part of the discussion, it's going to be on our website at calmatters.org and on our YouTube channel, so you can share it. And you'll find all of our virus coverage at calmatters.org/coronavirus. We've been working hard on this for months and hope you'll follow that coverage. I hope you'll go to our site, sign up for our newsletter so you can follow the coverage every day, and consider making a donation if you can to help our work. We are a nonprofit and we very much appreciate your support and your membership. 3 quick events to tell you about that are coming up. We're doing student town halls next week with the California Community Colleges Chancellor and the CSU Chancellor. Community colleges on Tuesday, the CSU's on Wednesday, and then one coming up in a couple weeks on the UCs, so students can ask about what's going on with learning, tuition, financial aid, anything else you need to know. And then if you're a parent or a care provider or a guardian, a teacher, join us next Thursday, the 20th, for a conversation about our kids' mental health, what behaviors to watch for in your child, and how to help them cope with the stress that we're all seeing during this pandemic. All that's at calmatters.org/events. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks again to Ricardo and our panelists. Stay strong, healthy, and safe. Thank you.